Attendees are in listen-only mode.
So welcome everybody to the next installment of the Our Crowd Teach-In Tuesday series. We try to do these series twice a month. That's barring any other unforeseen circumstances or any big deals that are coming down the pipeline. This is an opportunity for us to talk about the educational side behind a lot of the investments that we make, whether it's industry related, whether it's about startup investing in general, or whether it's about the startup environment. Tonight's program, From the Trenches to Traction, how Unit 8200 is transforming Israel's tech scene, that really goes to talk about what makes up the Israeli startup ecosystem, which is ranked perennially right behind Silicon Valley in terms of the types of entrepreneurs and the types of companies that it produces. I'm your host, Zach Miller. I'm a partner here at OurCrowd. Joining me will be Gadi Mazor, another partner here at OurCrowd, who's also our CTO and an 8200 grad. I'll let him introduce himself in a minute. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We hope to be in and out through the whole session within 50 minutes. That's 50 minutes. That means there'll be about 35 minutes of presentation. We have a short presentation here, and we'll talk about the 8200 unit and Gadi's experiences there as well. That'll leave about 15 minutes at the end for question and answers. You can ask questions through your GoToWebinar control panel. There's a question section there. Submit those to me, and I'll make sure that either I or Gadi answer them. We're also recording the event tonight, so if you want to review the video afterwards or share it, we'll send out a link to make that available for everybody. And lastly, we will share the slides as well in outgoing emails. So if you like the slides and you want to use them on your own, we'll make them available as well. Just quickly, as we're getting bigger and more successful, we have to put legal disclaimers on everything we're doing. We're not selling any securities here tonight. I'll let you guys read that on its own, but this is for informational purposes only. And let me just turn over to Gadi Mazor. Gadi, you want to introduce yourself and tell them about your background?
Well, I hope you would do that, but I mean, my background here is I'm, as it says, I'm 8200 or 8200 as it's called in Hebrew, graduate. I'm back, over 2 decades ago. Since then, since leaving the army, I served a total of 7.5 years in the army and left as a major. And then since then, I started quite a few companies in Israel, 3 main ones, and then joined OurCrowd as one of the first founders in the middle of 2012. And now within OurCrowd, I manage the platform or sprinkling holy water on the development of the platform. I would say being the CTO on the investment side and responsible for the international expansion of OurCrowd beyond Israel.
Thanks, Gadi. A little bit about me. I'm Zach Miller. I'm not a 8200 or 8200 grad, but I did graduate from Harvard and Kellogg, and I have a lot of respect for those guys as well. But I help to run the investor community here. If you've signed up at OurCrowd and accredited yourself on our website, I help to educate and provide information for our investors about how startup investing works and engender a feeling of community here. So OurCrowd really is a community. We invest in companies together. OurCrowd, of whom Gadi sits on the investment committee, has invested in over 52 companies since we started a little over 18 months ago. We've invested over $70 million in 52 companies. We do the research. We do the due diligence on our end. We invest our own money and then open up these opportunities on our website to our investor community. So I help to run that on this side. That's a little bit about us. We can talk more about that at the end. But before we get into really what makes up the 8200 unit and how the 8200 unit is now contributing to the whole of the Israeli startup ecosystem, I just want to talk a little bit about what the Israeli startup ecosystem is. And as I said earlier, it does rank perennially as the number 1 or number 2 tech ecosystem in the world, definitely number 1 after Silicon Valley. So there have been a couple studies. You have a quote here from Steve Ballmer, the previous Microsoft CEO, that you have a lot of these large tech companies around the world that have set up a research and development team here in Israel. They typically that's off of an acquisition that they do locally, and they build a team around it. Microsoft, as Ballmer said, really sees itself as much as an Israeli company as is an American company. But if you see these two things, I apologize, they come through a little bit fuzzy. This slide actually comes out of a report called the Startup Genome, which looked at was probably one of the most robust research reports done on what makes up a startup ecosystem that has to do with local talent. That means either at the university level or at the human resource level. Has to do with the number of companies being created, sources of funding locally. It takes, as we say, startup investing is a team sport. It does take a village to raise a startup, of which venture capital or angel-like money that we invest in is just one of those facets. So Tel Aviv, and speaking for Greater Israel in general, has one of these types of ecosystems that does turn out successful startup companies, and we're seeing it's turning out bigger and bigger startup companies. They're going public on NASDAQ, or they're being bought and acquired by large multinationals. So as you see, we rank up there next to Silicon Valley. The next companies that rank up there are very distant third. We're also known for our innovation. This is definitely something that Gadi will speak about in terms of what 8200 does. This is a little bit of an old slide from 2012, but The Economist and a couple other organizations rank innovation, the idea of being able to come up with novel or incrementally novel products and technologies. Israel is right up there behind Switzerland and Canada. Surprising that Canada may be ranked so high, but we're ranking up there. And whether it's this type of report or any other type of report, Israel now is considered, the number 2 startup ecosystem outside of Silicon Valley. We even have cases that we're seeing here in Israel of European startups that come to Israel, of Japanese startups that are coming to Israel to start up their operations here. They don't speak a word of Hebrew, but they're coming here to sort of participate in the startup environment and the milieu that we've created here that helps to support these companies through fruition. Another reason this is so important is Israel's tech scene does have startup infrastructure. Part of that is the culture that we talked about, this culture of innovations, culture of risk taking. I don't want to give away too much now because Gadi's going to touch on some of this later on in the presentation. But the infrastructure is very important here. We have incubators, we have venture funds. The universities are monetizing some of their technologies. We really have a robust, even though the country is very young, we have a very robust way of monetizing and developing ideas through to products, through to technologies, and ultimately to the market. So I'm going to turn the presentation over to Gadi right now. As we produce this presentation for everybody, and we talked about what are the major themes behind 8200, and I think Gadi's going to hit on those things. And if you want to get into more of the details at the end of the presentation, just ask questions. Gadi?
Thanks, Zach, for the introduction. So first of all, I must say that it's quite strange to publicly talk about 8200. Up until about 10 years ago, it was we never mentioned the number. It was never in the CVs of people. It was never mentioned in the press. And for instance, if someone dropped me off to get me to the base, he actually had to drop me off far from the base. It was not legal to drop me off at the base, even though it was quite evident with all the antennas and the big buildings. About 10 years ago, that started to change. First of all, because it did get public. I mean, more and more startup, more and more people started to talk about 8200, or again, I'll say 8200. I'll say 8200. That's the Hebrew name. And partially because it basically stopped being a secret. Partially also because there was a decision by the unit to market itself so that it can actually attract the best kids. We did a good job over the last 40 years doing this, but basically with the buzz and with the prestige around 8200, it's really much easier to get the best kids joining in the units.
Gadi, do you
saying
think
that, I'm not going to say anything too much about
the Startup Nation book,
me?
Saul Singer's book, Startup Nation. I think there was a whole chapter that spoke about the 8200. I think that also helped popularize.
Yeah, there was a chapter that absolutely, and I must say that when we saw the chapter in the book, to us that grew with this never say the number, never say the name, that was quite astonishing that was actually legal to publish that. So that was definitely part of a decision to allow that. I'm not going to actually, of course, say too much. I mean, not too much. Anything secret about the unit. I mean, you can read about the unit in Wikipedia. I'll give less information specifically about the unit than what the Wikipedia has. I'm going to talk specifically about the connection that I think there is between the culture in 8200 and the Startup Nation and kind of the whole ecosystem of startups in Israel. As you can see from the mission, I mean, the mission statement of this unit is quoted is saving lives. That's the first example that you see that we're not saying anything too specific about the unit. It's a signal intelligence unit, basically equivalent of the U.S. NSA. So again, you can read in Wikipedia, and if you know the NSA, you know what we're doing. It became, as this slide shows, it really became very, very prestigious to be in the unit and to be a graduate of the unit. At OurCrowd, for instance, when we see founders that approach us with a company and they say that there are 8,200 alumni, they will get a meeting with us. Not necessarily will decide to invest in their companies, but most companies don't. We filter 70% of the companies based on material. If the founders are from 8,200, we will give them the credit, and we will by default meet them. And that's generally the case with graduate of the units. There's a very strong alumni network. I mean, this is kind of the comparison to Harvard here, but there's a really close network of alumni, Facebook groups of specific units within the units, well-attended annual meetings of 8,200. And a lot of joint work between the companies. This slide shows a few of the companies that were founded by 8,200 alumni. And actually, I'll just touch one example. Checkpoint is mentioned here. I assume most of you know that's the company that in the early mid-90s invented basically the whole firewall space with a product called Firewall One. So they even branded the category. The founder served with me, a guy called Gil Shved. Gil, a little after leaving the army, he approached he approached a company called BRM. BRM was founded by the two Barkat brothers. One of them is Nir Barkat, the current mayor of Jerusalem, and Omri Man, who was an alumni of with Gil in the unit, or just before Gil in the unit. So Gil got a loan from BRM of $400,000. That's basically all the money the Checkpoint ever raised. Checkpoint returned the loan 9 months later. 9 months following that, they went public with a valuation of $560 million. So that was obviously a huge success story. And again, talking mid-90s. But this really is an example of how the network works. I mean, it's people that serve together, know each other, trust each other, and help each other after the army too. Next, please, Zach. So I want to discuss, and these are some of our thoughts and my thoughts on why this is. Why is 8,200 so successful in generating startups? So, of course, that partially is because the unit selects the very talented, the top of the top, and the selection process is very long. It starts with the basic army screening that kind of signals potential candidates based on their initial results in the basic screening and tests. Schools, the unit works with schools to recommend the top graduates. And basically, there are typically 5 to 7 stages of tests. I mean, really rigorous tests, all kinds of tests and interviews. And there's a whole unit within the intelligence corps that basically is responsible for recruiting the best of the best. Some of the units, some of the sections within 8,200 has precedence over any other unit in the Army except for the Air Force, so they can take pretty much anyone that they want into the unit, which was not the case up until 20 or 25 years ago when the combat unit has precedence. So 8,200 has, except for the Air Force, in most cases has priority over anything else in the Army. So that's, of course, the quality of the people. Next, please, Zach.
Hey, Gadi, before we move on to the next slide, and as much as you can talk about it, it is a selective process. What is the 8,200 unit screening for? What are they looking for? What are some of the qualities?
Well, 8,200 is a big organization. I mean, Wikipedia says that that's the largest unit in the Israeli army. So there are many different parts there. Some of them screen for specific kind of background or tendency to mathematics, computer science, hacking, that type of stuff. Some of it is more on the intelligence stuff and the ability to analyze sophisticated scenarios and kind of read between the lines. I mean, it basically covers quite a bit of the whole intelligence work in general. So,
Okay.
different units within 8200 look for different things.
Got it.
Okay, and then you get those people, and so you get those people in, and first of all, they get to work on the most important. I mean, going back to the slide before, life-saving. That's the target. So you get the best people, and you tell them, and you put them to work on the most important tasks of fighting terror, of getting intelligence, military, and terror intelligence. So that gets. I mean, in terms of motivation, there's no problem in terms of the focus on the task, and it teaches them. Next, please, Zach. The whole concept and the whole culture is culture of improvisation and bootstrapping and using tools, and the unit has basically any tools that it wants, but using tools without really saying to the guys how to actually use them. And this is the main point. Next, please, Zach. This is the main point that I want to make. I mean, those talented kids gets to the unit. They're basically given the tools and the equipment and the computers and everything they need to deal with important things that they know are important tasks, important objectives, and no one tells them this is how we do things. There's no indoctrination. There's no course that says these are the steps to solve the issue. I mean, I'll give you an example. I know personally a kid. He's 19. He shares half of my genes. He joined the unit about a year ago. He joined the course about a year ago. He joined the units a few months ago. 2 months into getting into the unit, he started a project. They gave him a kind of a new project to kind of get acquainted and dive into something. He made it actually quite big, and literally 6 weeks ago, he won one of the most prestigious annual prizes in the unit. Basically 2 months after getting into the unit, and at the ceremony, his commander told me that what he did was, and I quote, landscape changing on the intelligence side. And the main thing is, he was not told he was not told how to do things. He was given a task, and he had to invent and improvise. I always use a story. There's this famous semi-joke about a graduate math student that came to class a little late to the first lesson in a course in a semester. And the lesson actually started 15 minutes before the guy showed up, started by the professor writing on the board the 10 open questions of that field. So the questions in that math domain that were not solved yet by the mathematician in that field. And he went on. He came back a week later and told the other guys in the class, well, homework was so tough, I managed to solve only 2 of the 10. And that's I don't remember the name of the mathematician, but the main point here is that if you get talented people to work on a task without indoctrinating them, without telling them that it's not doable or it's tough or that's the way to do things, ingenuity and improvisation are very, very strong at that age. I heard about a year ago a lecture of Jane McGonigal. She's kind of a gaming culture expert, and she basically says that she thinks that, and that's in the US, of course, and she says that she thinks that we need to get gamers focus and work together on sophisticated, tough human and social problems, because those gamers are used to tackle in those virtual games, tackle significant battles, significant issues, cooperate between themselves, and basically 8200 does the same thing, but the game is very, very real and very, very important. So that's I think really the secret sauce. I mean, we had this saying when I was in the army. I think it still goes on, that a bit cocky, but basically says, you know, hard to do things we can do by tomorrow. The impossible might take a little longer, but that's a spirit. That's basically the whole training and the whole culture of the unit is such that things need to get done. You have the tools, you have the equipment, you have the resources to do that. No one tells you how to actually do this, so you invent things. And to facilitate that, Zach, please, next. To facilitate that, the unit sees itself as basically a very large incubator. So again, providing all the tools, providing the environment as much as a military unit can provide, but providing the environment to create those, to work on those projects. Next, please. The whole making sure that different units and different people with different skills cross-pollinate each other, and there's the interdisciplinary teams within the units when there's an important project. I mean, going back to the example of the kid that won the prize. I mean, that team that he was part of, he was a private, of course. He just joined the unit. There were people that were majors. There were lieutenants. I mean, all from different fields within the unit. So it's teams. It's basically like startups working on specific tasks with different people with different skills and resources. And the last piece, which I think is really important, next please, Zach, is the very, very flat structure of the unit. There's no, it goes with this no indoctrination. Again, Yoav, the guy, he was a private working with majors, lieutenants, I mean, and just as equal. And there's actually a story that became a new story that became somewhat of a legend in the last 6 months. There were basically two privates that made a bet, and one of them, when the head of the unit came to visit that specific unit within 8200, they had a bet on 50 shekels. 50 shekels is on a good day $15. And basically, one of the privates came up to the commander of the unit, the brigadier general, saluted and basically said, "Sir, can we change berets? Can I give you mine and get yours?" So the commander kind of thought for a second, laughed, and exchanged berets with him. About a month later, a major general, the head of the whole intelligence, came to the same unit, and the second private at that pair, that was a girl, she kind of repaid the guy the 50 shekel bet, and basically came to that major general and said, saluted and said, "Sir, can we exchange berets?" He laughed and said, "I heard the story. I bought a spare one. I have it in the car, and I'll bring that to you in a few minutes." So that's the whole culture. I mean, without indoctrination, with very flat structure, with teams that go from very experienced and high-ranked people to people that just joined the unit and joined the army, with a true belief that those new people are getting the best ideas. They need some guidance sometimes, some experience, but that's the whole ethos of how things work within the unit. Next, please. And when those guys are leaving the unit after working on tough, important tasks with the state-of-the-art technology and in state-of-the-art mechanisms and algorithms and all. I mean, then they come outside of 8200 with this basically belief that everything is possible. I'll give you an example. I mean, a very personal example. I was almost 20, I think, just a few months after finishing officer's course. I was the head of a unit within the unit, commander of a unit within the unit. And some Friday afternoon, and back then, I mean, now the unit doesn't work on Fridays, but back then we used to work until about 1 p.m. on Fridays. And it was actually later. It was about 3 o'clock that day, and we managed to do something, again, without details, but we managed to do something that I knew is actually going to save lives if we're quick enough. In this case, actually, American lives, not Israeli lives. And I basically went to the second to the head of the unit. He was still in. I basically came and said, I know that there is a process and procedure of how we pass that to our counterparts and to our partners in the U.S. I kind of, as the owner of this, say that we need to pass that immediately, as is, without any red tape, without any modifications, because this was talking about something that would happen a few hours later. He looked literally 15 seconds at what I wrote was in there, and kind of I remember he was later the head of intelligence, and he kind of brought his eyes up and said, "Bless you, I'll deal with this." And then he called me 2 weeks later to thank me. I said that the Prime Minister called the head of the unit to ask to thank, because he was visiting the U.S. and the U.S. President thanked him for what we did. So you leave the unit after doing these things and after dealing with those tasks. Whatever you encounter in a startup is always considered just doable. I mean, you've done much quicker, much more important, much more sophisticated things already, and you come out with the skills, with the network, with the knowledge, but again, more importantly, with basically the notion that everything is feasible. Just to finish with the last example, Waze, for instance, a major part of the leading people at Waze came out of the unit. Waze, if anyone managed to talk about Israeli startup and not hear the Waze name in the last year, that's a company that was bought by Google earlier in 2000 and earlier this year actually for $1 billion. They do the navigation, community-based navigation solution for mobile devices. And I was the first one that actually, the VCs that invested in them, the first VC that invested in them, the partner that managed the investment was my CFO at one of the companies. So he actually asked me to look at them, and I came, and they basically disrupted completely the whole navigation industry at that time. That was 2007. People paid between $10 and $15 per month for navigation. They basically came with a completely disruptive business model of the end user doesn't pay anything, because they managed to create the maps out of the users. So the users, as they went, the users were actually creating the maps and building the maps, which by then that was 50% of the whole math of navigation, was basically the creation of the maps. That was the majority of the money that was earned and spent on the annual creation of the maps, and they created online real-time maps. But the point that I want to make is that I met these guys. There were 3 guys back then, two of them out of the unit, and I kind of said, okay, this sounds like a cool idea. How much time do you think it will take them take you to build that? And the guy said, what do you mean? I can show you a demo. I mean, he had that working on his device about 4 months after starting that. The whole notion, or the whole thought that you can actually do this, is something that I believe that without the training and without the experience in the unit, had he went to a computer science university and went through BA and MA in computer science, he would basically learn through that it's basically impossible what he was going to do. And the whole notion and the whole spirit coming out of the unit was, this is, it might take some time. It's not impossible, so it might take some time, but it's definitely doable. And I think that's basically the driving force behind how 8200 really benefits the whole the whole infrastructure and the whole ecosystem of startups in Israel. Zach, do you want to mention a few samples in our portfolio?
Sure. Thanks, Gadiel. We'll give you a chance to catch your breath. That was a great presentation. There are some questions that have come through for Gadi. We're nearing, the question and answer part of the session. If you do have questions about the 8200 unit or about Israeli tech in general, about the entrepreneurial community here, please submit those through in the questions section in the GoToWebinar control panel you should see on your desktop. So as Gadi said, 8200 is not enough. Being part of the 8200 is not enough necessarily to get an investment from OurCrowd and our investors, but it definitely warrants a first meeting. We have deployed money into multiple companies that are backed or have senior leadership from the 8200 unit. You can see a couple of names here, just to give you an example of like the multidisciplinary focus that this group has and has taken out of the Army and brought into the commercial world. So BioCatch is a really interesting company that developed really a behavioral-based way to prevent fraud. So, if you think of what the leading ways, Google or even your bank have to make sure that, the right person is logging into your account, most people think of like dual-factor authentication, right? So you use your password and maybe there's an SMS that's also sent to your phone. You need to have, you have to reconfirm that you're the same person you say you are. BioCatch does it completely differently. BioCatch actually learns the behavioral patterns of the account holder, right? So the way that you swipe with your mouse, whether you right click or whether you use control click. And it does sort of very almost imperceptible cognitive games where it'll hide the cursor for your mouse and have you find it. And so they found that there's, 18 or 25 different patterns of the way people, find their mouse on the screen if it's hidden. They use all those things to build a profile of a user, so they're actually continuously authenticating you throughout a session. Very interesting company based, has a commercial office now in Boston and has some, beta installments in some of the world's global largest banks. Look at Crosswise. Crosswise is if you think of high frequency trading in the hedge fund world, they provide a similar model for the algorithmic trading of advertising online. But they help to solve one of the major problems in the market that it's very hard to tell, who's using which device, right? So I may log into my work computer in the office and then I leave and I'm on my Nexus phone. I come home and maybe I'm using an iPad. It's very hard for the advertising industry to say, hey, it's the same user on each one of those devices. Crosswise has a solution for that. NextPeer is a gaming platform. Move Interactive turns every surface into an interactive touchscreen. Mentad actually has a predictive model to help advertisers target the next best or their newest customer. Just a smattering of different companies we have here, but you can see the breadth of the types of skills that 8200 graduates pick up within the Army. Move to the next slide. A little bit, as I said, about OurCrowd in the beginning. We launched our site in 2013. Since then, we've invested in over 50 companies and deployed over $70 million into them. We're an equity crowdfunding platform, which means that the opportunities are online. We're doing our research, of which Gadi is a part of, offline. We're meeting with companies. We're doing our own due diligence. We're looking at the team. We're seeing if they're in the 8200 unit, what skills they've left with, what skills they're looking to parlay into commercialization. We drill down into, we're seeing upwards of 150 opportunities per month. We're looking to do 2 or 3 of those after they pass our rigorous screening. We then invest our own money and open up the opportunity onto our website so that investors from over 30 countries around the world can participate. It's an exciting time. Each deal we put up there, I have investors come back to me and say, wow, like I never even thought of that. And it's just, in my mind, it's the startups and the people behind them that are the most exciting part of OurCrowd. And that's pretty much it for the presentation. As Gadi said, we were going to keep it short, at least on the presentation side. There are a few questions that have come through already. If you do have a question for either of us, now's the time to send that through. We want to make sure that everybody leaves in time. So Gadi, I'm gonna start out. This question comes through from Martha. One of the things that you mentioned is, and I'm paraphrasing here, is that what 8200 does really well is it create a very flat organization. So, you have a young kid who's 18 years old and he needs to learn a complex, math or physics problem. Like, where does he go for help? Where's the hierarchy? How does he scale sort of the knowledge curve?
So that's the beauty of this. I mean, the teams are basically built without really taking into account ranks and how much time. Basically, not ranks. So we had teams, project teams that had young kids that had the math expert that we knew was maybe the one I have in mind is basically was I think 25 years in the army. He was known to be just a huge expert in a specific field in math, and he would be completely perfect with being in a project with kids that joined the unit just a few months before. So the task force for specific project is built without taking into account how many years, etc. Basically by the skills of the people. So if we think that someone, in the case of this 19-year-old Yoav, if that project had people that had experience for many years, ranked higher than him, but they were on there not to command and not to manage the project, but basically to be part of that because their experience and their knowledge was important to be part of the project.
So there's almost like facilitators within the group.
In many cases, actually, the facilitators are the young guys.
Okay.
It's and that goes with in many cases it's their projects. The older guys or the more experienced guys are resource. So to the question, for instance, if someone needs information on something very specific technically, he would have the resources and the people to go and ask specific questions and get more training and get more information. But the whole project in many cases will be actually his project and not the project of the captain or the major.
Got it. Maria asked a question, Gadi. I guess it's somewhat sensitive, but what is the percentage of women at the 8200 unit, if there are any?
Oh, there definitely are. There are women. I don't know the actual percentage, but I would say that it's my bet is that it's close to 50%. I mean, definitely in the tens and not the 1 or 2 tens. It's those courses. I'm trying to think if I know the numbers. There was a course that was. I know the numbers of a course that just finished 6 months ago, and it was 45% women. So it's boys and girls pretty much almost equal.
Has that changed over time? Was it that the case when you were in the course?
That changed over time. So it changed in 2 ways. I mean, first of all, when I was in the course, we had 25% women. So still not 0, but we had a quarter that were women. There were specific courses in which there was 50-50 or even more women, but those were back then, and again, I'm talking over 2 decades ago, back then those courses were the least prestigious. So it changed in 2 kind of axes. One is more women and more equally spread over whatever course it is or whatever unit it is.
That's interesting. So as the percentage of unit has of women in the unit has grown over time, do you expect to see that there'll be more women entrepreneurs, just like the men are leaving and starting up cool companies? Do you expect to see that over time?
I think that over time you would see that. I think that, and Evelyn is another partner in the fund, we had a lot of discussions on why that's not seen at the level that we were hoping and we think should be the level. And again, it's a whole discussion, and we can dive into this. But I think it's that unfortunately, women when they leave the army, or at the age that men and women leave the army at the early 20s, the social scenarios and social pressures are different on men and women in terms of careers and kind of directions that they take. I think that. Definitely in the army, it's more and more equal between the genders.
That's interesting. And by the way, one of our investors, one of the people in the audience mentioned that those numbers that you described now, 25% female 25 years ago, that's migrated up to 45 to 50% now, also match the same numbers of the classes at MIT. So it's interesting societal shift.
Yeah, yeah.
So one investor asked, and I guess it's worth making it a larger question. I don't know if you're familiar with the U.S. company Palantir, but there've been a variety of sort of think tank slash skunk works companies or projects like Xerox PARC I'm thinking of that have created tremendous technologies and entrepreneurs. How is 8200 compared to some of those companies or those events?
I mean, I'll give another example. The MIT Media Lab is such an organization, right? I mean, and I think that the MIT Media Lab, and I know, how, again, maybe back 15 years ago, I know how that was built and operated. And that's, I mean, if you think about the culture, that was a very similar culture. So you had people like Negroponte with tons of experience and tons of prestige. But when you actually looked at how the projects were done, it was undergraduates and graduates and professors working together, in many cases very interdisciplinary, but basically with no rank. I mean, with no. Unlike, for instance, a law firm that you have the juniors and you have the guys that want to become a partner and a senior partner, and it's. So I think that, and I'm not familiar with with all the companies you mentioned, but I think that innovation comes with this disruption, inducing environment and indoctrination, and this is how we do things, does not really foster innovation.
Just apropos that point, a question came through. So reading the book. Startup Nation book by Saul Singer. One of the participants on the webinar had the impression that there's not much discipline / hierarchy in the group. Is that a right way to think about it? And if so, how is that managed?
That's definitely the case. I mean, the kids that are getting to the units are all again, socially speaking, so statistically speaking, are all very good kids. So you don't have huge disciplinary issues, but to some degree, the unit kind of, the whole, these legendary stories of the private that goes to the major general and basically swaps berets. That's part of the culture. That's part of the. It's like kids playing games in some cases, but somewhat. I can't say that I can think of a case that such a culture or such a behavior was really out of line. So it's a kind of a polite or somewhat civilized chaos, and not really. It's. I can't think of we had, for instance, I'll just give an example. We had, for instance, every time someone got a new rank, there was a whole, pouring of water, and we kind of took that to extreme in some cases, which I think sometimes that was crossing some lines that I assume that in some units would not have been accepted, and that was okay in our unit. But that's basically the extent to which we went to. It's not really major discipline issues.
Well, I guess, and an investor asked a different way, what are the skills then that the 8200 members perhaps lack when they leave the Army that they need to catch up on to enter the startup world? And what organizations or how do they pick up those skills along the way?
That's absolutely a great question. And I think that you can even map startups or map companies in Israel that, and you can see different cultures. So I'll give you an example. We mentioned Checkpoint before. So if I go again 15 years back, there were three main high-tech companies in Israel. I mean, it was Checkpoint, it was Converse, the developers of the voicemail system for landlines and cell phones, and Amdocs, developer basically of major carrier operator networks. I mean, systems for the carriers. The culture in the two companies that came out of 8200, which were Checkpoint and Converse, was completely different than the culture in Amdocs. Amdocs was much more, it still is, much more rigid, army-like organization with processes, with hierarchy, with procedures, to the good and the bad. And again, 8200 doesn't indoctrinate people, but basically the indoctrination was no indoctrination. So I'm in that doctrine of not being a very organized, structured, ranked organization. But people from our unit going to work at Amdocs found it in some cases very, very hard to adjust. And I think that's in some cases what's lacking in companies and startups that are starting by the entrepreneurs, by the 8200 entrepreneurs. I think that, for instance, Gil Schmed is a huge successful example of someone that made the shift to become a very structured, great CEO without losing the entrepreneurship and in kind of the moving quickly culture that I think he saw at the unit, but still create a major company with the processes and with the channels and with the structure that made it what it is.
Hey, Gadi, I think we have time for one more question. There are a couple others that we're not going to get to. I apologize. If you are interested in hearing from them, let us know. I'll do my best to answer them or have Gadi answer them. If we didn't get to your question, please let us know. And this may be a hard question to end on, Gadi, but we're going to throw it to you anyway because you are an 8200 grad. You talked about a lot of different things about what makes up the unit and what makes the unit so special. One of the attendees asked if there was one unique factor, what is the it that differentiates 8200 from its equivalents in other countries that really makes it successful in innovation and transfer of that ability to people who leave the unit and enter into the startup world?
I would go with the whole never tell them how to do things. All the courses, all the training gives, they give skills, they give knowledge, but when a project starts, it's brainstorming without preconceived notions on this is how things are done, and this is just something that has to be done, and it really goes through many different steps in the life of a kid in the unit of this. You have the responsibility, you have the tools, go figure yourself how to do that, and I think that's the main secret sauce piece.
I'm pumped. I want to go invest in new companies. Gadi Mazur, CTO and general partner here at OurCrowd. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much, Zach. Thanks.
And with that, we'll conclude the webinar. Again, if we will be sharing the slides, we'll be sharing the video as well. So look for an email probably tomorrow with a blog piece written up about this. If you have other questions that sort of came up or weren't answered, please reach out to us. We appreciate your time. We know I see people from multiple countries around the world dialing in to learn about Israeli tech and what makes it so special and unique. Reach out to us here. We're always happy to talk at OurCrowd about what we do and how we do it. Thanks for your time. We know it's valuable, and hopefully we'll catch you again on another Teach-In Tuesday session. With that, stay safe and be well, everybody.
Attendees are in listen-only mode.
So welcome, everybody, to the next installment of the OurCrowd Teach-In Tuesday series. We try to do these series twice a month. That's barring any other unforeseen circumstances or any big deals that are coming down the pipeline. This is an opportunity for us to talk about the educational side behind a lot of the investments that we make, whether it's industry related, whether it's about startup investing in general, or whether it's about the startup environment. Tonight's program from the trenches to traction, how Unit 8200 is transforming Israel's tech scene, that really goes to talk about what makes up the Israeli startup ecosystem, which is ranked, perennially right behind Silicon Valley in terms of the types of entrepreneurs and the types of companies that it produces. I'm your host, Zach Miller. I'm a partner here at OurCrowd. Joining me will be Gadi Mazor, another partner here at OurCrowd, who's also our CTO and an 8200 grad. I'll let him introduce himself in a minute. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We hope to be in and out through the whole session within 50 minutes. That's 50 minutes. That means there'll be about 35 minutes of presentation. We have a short presentation here, and we'll talk about the 8200 unit and Gadi's experiences there as well. That'll leave about 15 minutes at the end for question and answers. You can ask questions through your GoToWebinar control panel. There's a question section there. Submit those to me, and I'll make sure that either I or Gadi answer them. We're also recording the event tonight, so if you want to review the video afterwards or share it, we'll send out a link to make that available for everybody. And lastly, we will share the slides as well in outgoing emails. So if you like the slides and you want to use them on your own, we'll make them available as well. Just quickly, as we're getting bigger and more successful, we have to put legal disclaimers on everything we're doing. We're not selling any securities here tonight. I'll let you guys read that on its own, but this is for informational purposes only. And let me just turn over to Gadi Mazor. Gadi, you want to introduce yourself and tell them about your background?
Well, I hope you would do that, but my background here is I'm, as it says, I'm 8200 or 8200, as it's called in Hebrew, graduate. I'm back, over 2 decades ago. Since then, since leaving the army, I served a total of 7.5 years in the army and left as a major. And then since then, I started quite a few companies in Israel, 3 main ones, and then joined OurCrowd as one of the first founders in the middle of 2012. And now within OurCrowd, I manage the platform or sprinkling holy water on the development of the platform. I would say being the CTO on the investment side and responsible for the international expansion of OurCrowd beyond Israel.
Thanks, Gadi. A little bit about me. I'm Zach Miller. I'm not a 8200 or 8200 grad, but I did graduate from Harvard and Kellogg, and I have respect for those guys as well. But I help to run the investor community here. If you've signed up at OurCrowd and accredited yourself on our website, reports done on what makes up a startup ecosystem. That has to do with local talent. That means either at the university level or at the human resource level. Has to do with the number of companies being created, sources of funding locally. It takes, as we say, startup investing is a team sport. It does take a village to raise a startup, of which venture capital or angel-like money that we invest in is just one of those facets. So Tel Aviv, and speaking for Greater Israel in general, has one of these types of ecosystems that does turn out successful startup companies, and we're seeing it's turning out bigger and bigger startup companies. They're going public on NASDAQ, or they're being bought and acquired by large multinationals. So as you see, we rank up there next to Silicon Valley. The next companies that rank up there are very distant third. We're also known for our innovation. This is definitely something that Gadi will speak about in terms of what 8200 does. This is a little bit of an old slide from 2012, but The Economist and a couple other organizations rank innovation, the idea of being able to come up with novel or incrementally novel products and technologies. Israel is right up there behind Switzerland and Canada. Surprising that Canada may be ranked so high, but we're ranking up there. And whether it's this type of report or any other type of report, Israel now is considered, the number 2 startup ecosystem outside of Silicon Valley. We even have cases that we're seeing here in Israel of European startups that come to Israel, of Japanese startups that are coming to Israel to start up their operations here. They don't speak a word of Hebrew, but they're coming here to sort of participate in the startup environment and the milieu that we've created here. I help to educate and provide information for our investors about how startup investing works and engender a feeling of community here. So OurCrowd really is a community. We invest in companies together. OurCrowd, of whom Gadi sits on the investment committee, has invested in over 52 companies since we started a little over 18 months ago. We've invested over $70 million in 52 companies. We do the research. We do the due diligence on our end. We invest our own money and then open up these opportunities on our website to our investor community. So I help to run that on this side. That's a little bit about us. We can talk more about that at the end. But before we get into really what makes up the 8200 unit and how the 8200 unit is now contributing to the whole of the Israeli startup ecosystem, I just want to talk a little bit about what the Israeli startup ecosystem is. And as I said earlier, it does rank perennially as the #1 or #2 tech ecosystem in the world, definitely #1 after Silicon Valley. So there have been a couple studies. You have a quote here from Steve Ballmer, the previous Microsoft CEO, that you have a lot of these large tech companies around the world that have set up a research and development team here in Israel. They typically that's off of an acquisition that they do locally, and they build a team around it. Microsoft, as Ballmer said, really sees itself as much as an Israeli company as is an American company. But if you see these two things, I apologize, they come through a little bit fuzzy. This slide actually comes out of a report called the Startup Genome, which looked at, was probably one of the most robust research that helps to support these companies through fruition. And another reason this is so important is Israel's tech scene does have startup infrastructure. Part of that is the culture that we talked about, this culture of innovations, culture of risk taking. I don't want to give away too much now because Gadi's going to touch on some of this later on in the presentation. But the infrastructure is very important here. We have incubators, we have venture funds, the universities are monetizing some of their technologies. We really have a robust, even though the country is very young, we have a very robust way of monetizing and developing ideas through to products, through to technologies, and ultimately to the market. So I'm going to turn the presentation over to Gadi right now. As we produce this presentation for everybody, and we talked about what are the major themes behind 8200. And I think Gadi's going to hit on those things. And if you want to get into more of the details at the end of the presentation, just ask questions. Gadi?
Thanks, Zach, for the introduction. So first of all, I must say that it's quite strange to publicly talk about 8200. Up until about 10 years ago, it was we never mentioned the number. It was never in the CVs of people. It was never mentioned in the press. And for instance, if someone dropped me off to get me to the base, he actually had to drop me off far from the base. It was not legal to drop me off at the base, even though it was quite evident with all the antennas and the big buildings. About 10 years ago, that started to